thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from January 12th, 2020. Join us as we continue our study in the book of Hebrews with Pastor Dax.
When Jesus Christ entered into the world, that brought a radical change to redemptive history. A change that was so radical that at this point now, any attempt or desire to go back to God's previous way of doing things is to abandon God altogether. Now, when Jesus came into the world, also this wasn't God, changing his mind on the plan or implementing a plan B. Rather, Jesus coming into the world, this was according to God's predetermined timeline, and it was his design to save his people, and it was moving from promise to fulfillment with the advent of Jesus. And the fulfillment of God's saving promise was realized in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's a moment in history that the writer of Hebrews later refers to as the end of the ages, what Jesus accomplished when he came. When everything that God had designed to foreshadow his salvation plan culminated. The old covenant and all of the old ways that were attached to that covenant, which those things served their purpose very well, with Jesus entering the world, all of it now finished. The veil in the temple, right, torn in two from top to bottom. The temple itself destroyed, not one stone left on top of another. Now, not that those things were unimportant, right? After all, those things were God's ideas to begin with. But the point is, when God's ordained purpose for those things was achieved in Jesus Christ, those things were no longer necessary. And for this morning here, what I want to do is focus on just one major aspect of what God fulfilled from the old covenant in the coming of Jesus. With the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Levitical priesthood was rendered obsolete. The Levitical priesthood, you know what I'm talking about. The priesthood of the Old Testament with the sons of Levi who filled that role. The Levitical priesthood was made redundant. The service of the priests was no longer necessary. Now, we've talked about this before, what the work of an old covenant, a Levitical priest was. Really two major things, right? One of those things was that the priest interceded for the people of God. He prayed on behalf of the people of God. And number two, he made atonement for the people of God. He offered sacrifices as a representative of the people before God. So that's what he did. He acted as a representative, an intercessor, a mediator, and he offered a sacrifice to make atonement for the people. Those were his two big functions. And those two priestly duties, making intercession and making atonement, those things were coextensive. And what I mean by that is the people for whom the priest prayed and the people for whom the priest offered sacrifices were one and the same people. But when we move out of that era of promise towards the era of fulfillment with the coming of Jesus, those very same two priestly duties reach their culmination in Jesus and his ministry. In other words, he now is the priest who makes intercession for his people and the priest who offered a once and for all sacrifice for his people, right? And that really, from this point in the letter of Hebrews all the way through chapter 10, apart from one little interruption, is the primary emphasis for the next 6 chapters. That Jesus Christ is the great and ultimate high priest. Now, we want to ask, why did the original readers of this letter need to know that Jesus is their great and ultimate high priest? And I think we can come up with a few reasons. Number one, if we remember in just what we've looked at so far, some of these people seem to have been tempted to go back to Judaism. And as a result, they needed to understand that Judaism, as a way to God, as a way to salvation, is no longer an option. It's been rendered obsolete. What was conceived in the old covenant has been birthed in the new covenant. Another reason that they would need to know that Jesus is their great high priest is that now they can answer their Jewish friends and family who might have been asking, well, so this Christian thing, how do you get to God without a priest? Who's going to be the mediator between you and God? And the writer of this letter is affirming that Christians do have a priest, one who is the perfect fulfillment of all of those inadequate priests. And another reason that they would need to know that Jesus is their high priest, and I think why the writer inserts that right here, is he desires to comfort his readers with this truth. Remember the pattern that we talked about in Hebrews where he will often comfort the afflicted and then turn around and afflict the comfortable? And he kind of alternates between doing those two things. And if you've been paying attention in the chapters that we've been in leading up to this point, if you've kind of felt the weight of those chapters, then you understand the need for comfort here, because he has been speaking very strongly about the need to persevere. He's been reminding these Jewish Christians of the failure of their ancestors in the wilderness to reach God's rest, and he's been pleading with them, hey, learn from their disaster. Right? It's not enough to just say that you believe. Real faith will prove itself out by enduring to the end. And he knows that even as they receive this letter, they are experiencing very real opposition, and that it's going to get even worse very soon. But the point of him encouraging, exhorting these people to endure is not that, somehow just if they can just be strong and gritty enough, they can, pull themselves up and endure whatever they're going to go through. That's not what's meant by Christian perseverance. No, he wants them to know, and this is where he turns the corner in these verses we're going to be in this morning. He wants them to know they're not alone in this. They don't have to persevere alone. They have a high priest who, by virtue of his own human experience, can fully relate to their dilemma and provide them with whatever grace they need to persevere faithfully all the way to the end. By the way, that's why any Christian perseveres, right? It's not just because some people tend to have sort of a naturally higher commitment level or better follow-through rate. It's because we have a high priest who faithfully fulfills his priestly work. Remember that priestly work, that one-time act of making atonement for Jesus, and also the ongoing act of continually interceding for us before the Father to give us everything we need to endure to the end. I think often as Protestants, right, as non-Catholics, we can be kind of ignorant of our need for a priest. We kind of recoil at the term priest. But what do you think Jesus is doing at this very moment for believers? This is what the writer is saying. This is the point he's making. In fact, look at the end of verse 14 there, where he says, let us hold fast to our confession. He's saying, don't fall back. Don't give up what we've confessed with our lips. And he includes himself there. Notice that. Let us hold fast to our confession. And to encourage you to hold fast, to endure, he's saying, in effect, let me remind you that at the Father's right hand sits a man in glory to ensure that you have everything you need to hold fast, to endure. And he refers to Jesus here as a great high priest. Now, keep in mind, again, this letter is originally written to Jewish Christians who surely still spoke and understood Hebrew. And in Hebrew, that title high priest is literally great priest. In other words, Jesus is a great, great priest. The greatest of all priests. Greater than all other priests. And that fits right into what we've seen in this letter already, right? That Jesus is greater than everything. We've already seen that Jesus is greater than the prophets, that he's greater than the angels, that he's greater than Moses, that he's greater than Joshua. And now, Jesus Christ is presented as the greatest of all priests, the ultimate fulfillment of what all other priests could only foreshadow. And so that's our big question this morning. What makes this great, great priest so great? What sets Jesus apart as the greatest of all priests? And to answer that question, we just want to look at four glorious truths. Here's the first one. What makes Jesus, this great, great priest, so great? Number one, Jesus actually accomplished what all other priests could only prefigure. Jesus actually accomplished what all other priests could only prefigure. Look at verse 14. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens. Now, we have to work to remember what would have been very familiar to these Jewish Christians. And that is that once a year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest, the Levitical high priest, he took blood into the temple to make atonement for the people. And remember, he first passed through the door of the outer court, and then he went through another door into the holy place, and finally he passed through the veil into the Holy of Holies. And once he was in there, in the presence of God on earth, he didn't stay very long. Because a sinner doesn't relax in the presence of absolute holiness. He stayed behind the veil long enough to do one thing, to sprinkle the blood of the atonement on the mercy seat that was atop the Ark of the Covenant. And that was a symbolic atonement for the sins of the people of Israel, including his own sins. And then once he finished that duty, he got out of there. The problem is that all of that religious activity could never pay the price for even the smallest, most seemingly insignificant of sins. Not one white lie, not one momentary bad attitude, not a single fleeting prideful thought. No, the whole thing every year served just one purpose. It was to foreshadow the atonement that would actually be accomplished one day by the greatest of high priests. And God's own Son came to us in human flesh to fulfill that role, didn't he? He shed his blood on the cross. He was buried in the tomb. He was raised on the third day. And after 40 days of ministry in his resurrected body, Jesus Christ passed from the sight of his disciples, remember this in Acts chapter 1, through the heavens and directly into the real Holy of Holies, the very throne room of God. And how do we know that the offering of his own blood in the place of his people was sufficient, was acceptable to God? Because when he got to that place, to the real Holy of Holies, there was no hurry to leave. That little phrase in verse 14, passed through the heavens, it's in what is called the perfect tense, which all that means is that it talks about an action that happened in the past, but one that has ongoing, continual results in the present and into the future. In other words, Jesus Christ passed through the heavens and he is still there, is how we can understand that. And more than that, when he arrived into that place, he did what no other priest before him could ever do, right? He sat down. Why? Because holiness is comfortable in the presence of holiness. His work was finished. I want to jump ahead a little bit in the book of Hebrews and just read some passages that show you how the writer keeps coming back to this idea and explains this. So over in chapter 8, verse 1, he writes, "Now the point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places," listen, "in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man." He's at work in the true tabernacle, not the earthly copy. He's serving at the real thing. And go over to chapter 9, beginning in verse 11. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, notice, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Jump down to chapter 9, verse 23. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are the copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf, on behalf of believers. Verse 25, nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. All of that is to make this simple point, that Jesus Christ actually accomplished what all other priests could only prefigure. He did the real thing in the real place. And that's part of what makes him such a great priest. Every other priest could only sort of anticipate and foreshadow that priestly ministry as a copy of the reality. But Jesus actually accomplished what all other priests could only prefigure. So that's the first glorious truth about our great priest in this passage. So back to Hebrews chapter 4 and glorious truth number 2. What makes this great priest so great? Truth number 2, Jesus' unique status qualifies him as the greatest of priests. His unique status qualifies him as the greatest of priests. Look at the middle of verse 14, where the writer reminds us of this when he says, Jesus, the Son of God. Now, those words aren't there by accident. That's not just some filler or a little bit of flourish. Right? Those words convey two important truths that distinguish this high priest from all other priests. There's the word Jesus, stressing his full humanity, and there's the title, the Son of God, stressing his full deity. This is a very important thing to understand when it comes to the priesthood of Jesus Christ. A priest is a mediator, a bridge builder, a go-between. And what makes a mediator in any situation acceptable to both parties is that he is acceptable to both parties. Right? He's got something in common with both parties to make reconciliation possible. And there could never be a more effective mediator, a greater high priest than this. Because as being fully God, Jesus can speak on equal terms with the Father. And as being fully human, he is able to represent us perfectly before the Father. Now again, already in this letter here in the Hebrews, the writer has been working to establish both of these things, Christ's deity and Christ's humanity. Something that theologians call the hypostatic union. It just refers to this mystery that the divine and the human natures meet in the single person of Jesus Christ. If we think back, chapter 1 of Hebrews, it stresses the deity of Christ, his godhood. And then chapter 2 turns around and stresses the humanity of Christ. And I think the writer has been intentionally laying that groundwork in anticipation of what he writes here in chapter 4, where these two natures converge into one person, Jesus, the Son of God. And it's because Jesus Christ holds these two natures simultaneously that he is uniquely qualified to be the only high priest who could possibly bridge the chasm that exists between sinful human beings and a holy God. We just came out of Christmas time, right? And these familiar verses that we read. But listen to what they convey. What makes Jesus such a great, great high priest? Well, for to us a child is born, his humanity. To us a son is given, his deity. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, his humanity, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us, his deity. Jesus has a unique status as the God-man that qualifies him as the greatest of all priests. So what makes this great, great priest so great? Here's the third glorious truth now. Jesus is perfectly compassionate because he has endured the full force of temptation's power. Let me say that again. Jesus is perfectly compassionate because he has endured the full force of temptation's power. Now the writer, he makes the same point here twice. First he says it negatively, then he says it positively in verse 15. Look at it. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, negatively. Now positively, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And I think it's possible here that the issue, what these Jewish Christians who are reading this, hearing this for the first time may have been wondering, is something maybe you've wondered before too. Now that Jesus has ascended to heaven, now that he sits in glory at the right hand of the Father, can he relate to us? Can he understand what I'm going through? Does he get my condition, my problems? Is he indifferent to all of that? Is he preoccupied? Surely he has bigger things to worry about than me and my problems. Is he even aware of what's going on? Does he still care? And the writer wants us to know that Jesus, our man in glory, has an unparalleled understanding and sympathy toward his people. Why? Because of his own authentic experience as a human being. Sometimes we think that because Jesus was truly God, that he was immune from temptation, that the arrows of temptation just bounced off his chest like he was Superman or something. But that's a Gnostic view of Jesus Christ, because it diminishes Jesus' full humanity. 1 John, which we read together earlier, it addresses that in the strongest possible terms. He says, "By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God." The point he's making there in 1 John is that this is how you can know that a prophet or teacher is from God. He acknowledges the full humanity of Jesus Christ. I think we forget this, that Jesus Christ was just and is just as human as you and I are. He didn't just appear to be a man. He was a real man in the full sense of what that means. He had a real human body with real human bodily functions and a real human mind and real emotions. And he had all of the inherent weaknesses that go along with being human apart from sin. We understand that Jesus is fully God, fully divine. And that when he took on human flesh, he didn't surrender his deity. He didn't become less God, though often he willingly laid aside the independent exercise of some of his divine attributes in obedience to the Father. So, for example, Jesus in human flesh, he had to learn how to crawl. And then he had to learn how to walk. And then he had to learn how to run. Jesus, as a boy, he had to learn how to talk and how to read and how to write. He was human in every way. Sin was the only human experience that Jesus Christ had no part. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. Don't think that I'm downplaying the deity of Jesus Christ, right? I affirm his full deity as strongly as ever. But in this verse, it's the humanity of Jesus Christ that's being emphasized for the purpose of bringing us comfort and confidence in that. If you guys know me at all, then you know I'm not a musician. But I was reading this week about something, this musical term, something called sympathetic resonance. Sympathetic resonance. I had no idea what that meant, but the way it was explained was, for example, if there's two pianos in a room and you strike a note on one of those pianos, then the same note in the other piano gently responds even though you didn't touch it at all. You see the point? Christ's human instrument is just like yours in every way. And though his instrument is in heaven, still when a note of weakness is struck in your humanity, it resonates in his. As a result of his full humanity, he can sympathize with your weakness. But also, the other reason he can sympathize with human weakness, the text says, is because he was the object of every kind of temptation. Every kind of temptation, not every temptation, right? Jesus was never tempted to waste too much time on Facebook or watch too much TV, or he never experienced the temptation of married life or what it's like to be an elderly person, right? He didn't experience every single temptation, but he experienced temptations in every area that are inherent to human weakness. So, temptations to pride, temptations to selfishness, to greed, to lust, to materialism, doubt, fear, all of those things that can manifest in many different ways in our lives. Jesus experienced all those kinds of temptations, but what sets him apart from all other priests, and for that matter, from all other human beings, is that he never once yielded to those temptations. Think about that. That tells us something about Jesus. That tells us that Jesus Christ experienced temptation to a degree that has never ever been experienced by another human being. Don't think that the sinlessness of Jesus means that the temptations he faced were less powerful than what we face. The very opposite is true. The sinlessness of Jesus reveals that he experienced the greatest possible intensity of temptation. How can we say that? Well, because the only way to experience the full power of temptation is to never actually give into it. That's something you and I have never experienced. Because we give in long before we've experienced all there is to experience with temptation. No one was ever tempted like Jesus Christ was tempted. And we know that because he never once gave into it. He is without sin. Are you guys familiar with the Greek story Odysseus? Kinda, maybe you heard the name. Odysseus, the idea is he's sailing back from war, and he has to pass by this island, right, where the sirens live. These creatures that sing these, very beautiful songs, and the songs mask their deadly power, though, right? Because no man who's ever heard the song can resist the temptation of the song, and everybody who does hear it ends up dead on the shores of the island where these sirens live. And so Odysseus has a plan. He orders his men to plug their ears up with wax and tie him with his ears open to the mast of the ship. And he orders them, hey, if you see me struggling to get free, if I'm asking to be untied, just tie me even tighter. And so the ship comes into range of the siren's song, and as it does, this strange desire comes over Odysseus. He's tempted to succumb to the song. But his deaf sailors, as they see him struggle, they just simply bind him even tighter. And so Odysseus becomes this man who experiences to the full the desperate agony of hearing the song, and because of his prior decision, his prior action and commitment, the experience of being unable to give in to that temptation. He's tied there, arms stretched out and lashed to the crossbeam of the ship. And whatever longing, whatever temptation, desire he has to give in is kept in check because he had a predetermined plan, and the orders that he gave to his sailors keep him from giving in. Now again, the point is obvious, even though the analogy breaks down a little bit. But with Jesus, he was obeying his Father's orders. All throughout his public ministry, Satan sought to lure Jesus away with the siren song. Remember, in the wilderness, worship me and I'll give you the kingdoms of the world. Again, surprisingly, through the mouth of his own beloved disciple Peter. Lord, you can't go to the cross. I'm not going to let you die. Powerfully in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he cried out in agony to his Father, is this the only way? Must I drink from this cup? And I wonder, too, if that siren song was never more tempting than when Jesus was hanging from the cross and he hears from the onlookers the mocking, if you are the Son of God, come down, prove it. It's kind of the last note of the siren's tempting song. And he'd heard it all his life. And yet what's amazing is he never once gave into it, because he had lashed himself to the crossbeam of obedience. Now the temptations were real. They were powerful. They were more intense than anything you or I have ever experienced. And though Jesus in his deity could never have sinned, yet in his humanity, I wonder if he didn't always feel like he never could sin. He felt the fight of temptation more deeply than we will ever feel it. The agony of his obedience was squeezed out to the last drop, like an olive crushed in a press. And you see, that is why we have this sympathetic resonance in heaven. We have this high priest who is perfectly compassionate because he and he alone endured the full force of temptation's power. What makes this great, great priest so great? Here's the last glorious truth. Jesus supplies his people with whatever is necessary to persevere in the Christian life. Jesus, as our great high priest, supplies his people with whatever is necessary to persevere in the Christian life. Remember, the context of these verses has to do with perseverance, this call to endure, to remain faithful. Look at verse 16. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace. The perfect sacrifice of Jesus has been accepted by the Father. The veil has been torn in two from top to bottom. Christians now have free access into the very chambers of God himself. And while there is still a throne there, a throne of majestic sovereignty and power, because of the work of our great high priest, it is a throne to which even the vilest of sinners can draw near to. And as sinners in repentance draw near to that throne, there are two precious commodities listed here that we need to receive over and over again from this throne of grace. Look at it. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace. Why? That we may receive, first of all, mercy. When we think about the task of persevering, of enduring, of remaining faithful, we know that we are going to fail at that at times. Right? All of us will have failings in that. Sometimes those failures will be miserable. That's the reality. This is not a glossed over version of the Christian life that we're talking about here. But when we do fail, which we will, and then we come before God in our brokenness, in repentance, He promises to shower us with mercy, not condemnation. Why? How? Well, because sitting there at His right hand is our great priest, who is submitting evidence like a defense attorney of His redemptive accomplishments, of what He has done on our behalf. We have an advocate with the Father, 1 John says, a defense attorney with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. And the effect of that is that mercy then is ours to be received. And notice the second thing that we need over and over again from God's throne, that we may receive mercy and find grace. Grace to help in time of need. So when we think about our call to persevere in the faith, yes, we need mercy for all those times that we're going to fail. But we also need grace for the strength and the ability to endure at all. Grace. How accessible is this grace to us? How readily available is this mercy to us? Well, the old high priest, the high priest of the old covenant, remember, he could only enter into the Holy of Holies one time a year. And then it was only for a few minutes. But this verb in verse 16 is in the present tense. The sense here is, let us keep on continually approaching the throne of grace. This is not something you do just once. Let us keep on continually approaching the throne of grace. Keep coming for mercy. Keep coming for grace. Don't stop coming. That's how a Christian perseveres. Regularly coming to the Father to find mercy for your failures, and regularly coming to the Father to find grace for the strength to endure. And how do we know that God will give us exactly what we need at any given moment in time? Because our great high priest is right there, pleading our case. That sounds really good. You want to know what I think the problem is with this? I think a lot of us just don't believe it's enough. When it comes right down to it, there's got to be more to it than that. Give me a checklist of things I'm supposed to do, or things I'm supposed to say, or things I'm supposed to feel. I want to contribute something to make up for my failures. I want to do something to pull myself up in obedience. Now, the thing is, you can try to do these things on your own, or you can receive the mercy and grace of God. Which one do you want to go with? And the fact is, if God's mercy and grace are not enough for you, you still feel like you need to do something beyond that, that's probably the clearest indication yet that you've not genuinely experienced God's mercy and grace. Because once you have, you recognize that everything else, all your works, all your good deeds, are just cheap counterfeits, knockoffs of the real thing. And so this morning, is Jesus Christ your high priest? Because you need a high priest, you know. But if your priest is anyone or anything other than this priest we've been talking about this morning, that other priest won't do the job. He can't bridge the gap. He can't get you to heaven. He can't reconcile you to God. All of those attempts will only prove to be miserably inadequate. But the good news for those of us who trust in Jesus Christ is that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.